Good day, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this talk about standards over time at national and international levels. I'm going to start by saying why the issue is important as I see it, and then move on to say something about what the talk is about, and then on with the talk. About 20 years ago, Michael Barber, advisor to government after government, very influential figure, claimed that not only was large-scale reform possible, but it could be achieved quickly. And as we'll see, he was basing his claim on apparent rises in standards in the English educational system. So the talk is going to start by asking what standards are, and that will give a focus to what I'm going to talk about. It'll say something about the efforts that have been put in to raising standards, and then move to what kinds of tests or what kind of testing system could confirm that there's been a rise in standards. And then look at what evidence we have for standards over time, and that's both at the national level, and I won't go through every country, but just pick on a couple, and at the international level and pick out three of the more famous of the international studies. And then final response spoiler here. Why do we have such stability in the system? And what are the implications for testing, but also for research and for policy? So first of all, what do we mean by standards? And I think it's important here to distinguish two things. One is the setting of standards, and the other is the checking of standards. So we might see that a head teacher says that in our school one standard is that we wear uniforms. And then somebody goes out to check that there are in fact uniforms being used. Or we might find that some ruler of a country defines a weight that is to be used for selling potatoes or whatever, a stone, and produces a stone of a certain weight, and everybody must use that standard. And then we go into the marketplace and see if in fact the potatoes are being sold using that standard there. So I'm going to be talking here about checking on standards, not about setting standards. And when we're looking about standards of students and young people in what they do on their tests and otherwise, we often fall into a trap between one of two, that is ability-focused measures or curriculum-focused measures. And I'm going to be talking more about the curriculum-focused measures, the maths, the reading, and so on, as opposed to the IQ type of thing. But let's not forget that psychologists have been looking at standards of ability, of IQ, of G, Raven's progressive matrices for a long time, and have seen a remarkable rise in those standards, people's scores on the non-verbal test, the people's G factor, over decades. So much so that if you look back to our grandparents, you might wonder if they're really so thick. But in fact, it's a rise for non-verbal ability, which probably has the rise is flattening off, and it's not for the verbal ability. Certainly, my grandfather was able to do the Tymms crossword that I'm unable to do. And in this, I'll be referring to the kind of metrics, and I'll use effect sizes as a kind of check on whether standards have changed over time and by how much they have changed. So let's look at effect size, which I guess most people listening into this talk are aware of, and that an effect size would be a shift of one standard deviation. And we can look at this visually. So the effect size of 1 would imply that we have one distribution in the blue or the black, I can't quite distinguish with my eyes here, over to the pink or purple or puce, and then that's one standard deviation to the right, and that's a big effect. That's a large shift, and in education you won't see it in an intervention that you do normally. You won't see it 1 year to the next for the whole country, but it gives us an idea, and it doesn't shift everyone, it doesn't transform the world, but it makes a big difference. On the other hand, we might also think of an effect size of 0.2, to which I'll be referring much more commonly in this talk, and then that effect size looks like this. If in a classroom a teacher had one group of students, one standard deviation about another group, they would be noticeably distinguishable. If, on the other hand, the group were just a fifth of a standard deviation different, that teacher probably wouldn't really notice any difference between the two. And I'll be mentioning effect sizes lower than that, just to keep that image of the 0.2 in mind. Well, there have across the world been major efforts to raise standards. Internationally, the USA has had numerous reforms, the most famous of which is No Child Left Behind, but we can look at it time and time again, and ideas come and go, imported into there, exported from there, and so on. If you look at many countries, they got what was called the PISA shock, also known as the Tymms shock or whatever else, and that really triggered efforts to keep standards, keep the levels of attainment in comparison to other countries up to what they thought it was before they saw the data. In England, 1976, you have Jim Callaghan, the Prime Minister at the time, with his Ruskin college speech, which really set in train a kind of impetus for massive reform ever since. Tony Blair's famous for saying education, 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 and it continues and continues and continues, perhaps with a slightly different focus, but nevertheless with people taking an interest. I'm going to put down here Qatar and Indonesia as places where there have been major efforts that I'll come back to later just as markers. But of course, many other countries that I won't mention here have been involved. In fact, all the countries that I know have been involved in efforts to raise standards. And we spend a lot of money on education, my goodness. According to the OECD, the average yearly spend is about $10,000, and that's for the average for the primary, secondary, and tertiary pupils, and that's the OECD average. If you multiply up how many students there are across the OECD, you'll get to a figure with a lot of noughts on that. This is a large spend. In the United States, that's about $16,000, which is probably the highest around, or one of the highest. And then there's a massive growth of the expensive international comparative tests. I mentioned already PISA and Tymms, but there's PEARLS and there are others. And it just as a kind of marker here, if you look at Cambridge Assessment, which is a large international player, not quite as big as ETS, but certainly getting that way. And you've got ASA, and there are others around the world. In 2002, Cambridge Assessment had a revenue of £129 million, and that went up to 413 by 2016. Let's look at standards over time, and I'm going to pick out for the internal countries, England and the USA, and I'm going to pick England because we have lessons that we can learn. Following that Ruskin College speech that I mentioned, there was efforts to improve standards, and it was decided that we needed national testing, we needed national curriculum, we needed inspectors and so on, and that testing started to come in the 90s. It bedded down by 1995, and at that time in England we had a unit called the Assessment Performance Unit, which was tracking standards over time. It was disbanded because it was said the new accountability tests would do the job for us. Let's look at what happened. Here's a chart coming up of the percentage of children who got the level that was put as the standard to aim for, which was a level 4. And between 95 and 2000, you can see that these rose with one little blip for maths in the middle, year on year. And then it flattened off in 2000. And it was that graph that Michael Barber was referring to when he said you could reform a system quickly and let's get on with it. And he was writing there in an American teacher's periodical. But if you look at that chart carefully with a kind of quantitative eye, you can see a couple of things that don't quite ring true. The first is that there's a steep rise and then a flattening off. But if you were really monitoring standards carefully and accurately, you would probably see a rise and then it gradually falling off, not abruptly. And the second thing is that the maths and the reading, apart from that one or two blips, hug each other. The difference between the maths and the reading in 95 is identical to the difference in maths and reading in 2004. Well, surely one of your efforts would have been more effective than the other. We know, for example, that schools have more impact on maths than they do on reading. So we'd expect the maths to be more susceptible to reform than would be reading. During this period, we had at Durham been collecting data on reading at year 6, when these end of key stage tests were being carried out. And we had our own reading test, which we didn't change year on year, used it with the same hundreds of schools year on year, and we hadn't seen any changes in the reading scores. Well, I found that other people had also collected data. In fact, I could find 12 other studies where they'd collected data. So in data, I had data on 2/3 assessments going over the years. And so we could look at what really happened. And what happened was that the English rose, but not nearly by much as was said. That's from about 48% to about 58%. And the maths also rose, and it rose more. Maybe from about 45% to about 75%. And effect sizes, that rise for English is about half a standard deviation, and that rise for English about a fifth. Well, we can think about what went wrong. And in fact, even those little rises that I said, that rise of about a fifth is about what you would expect if you'd never done testing and then suddenly you were doing testing. Just practice. So this new test was a new accountability test, and it will show rises in scores, even with no rise in standards. We've got Campbell's law, which says that, and we've got Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law, if you make something an indicator, then it loses its value as an indicator because people start to play the game. And the Goodhart's law, if you introduce a new test, then scores will rise, even though nothing's happening under it. Incidentally, those two laws were invented at the same time, and there's an interesting article that I've put into the list at the end, which discusses who was first. There's no clear answer to it. The other thing that went wrong was they used different tests every year, and so they weren't equated as tests on a scale, but rather they aimed to make the cut scores, the score that was equating to a level 5 or 4 or above each year. The anchor test they had, they ignored, and so each year was compared to the last year. It wasn't compared to the year before that or the year before that, but each year to the last year. So in one year, you set the standard against the last year, the next year to the previous year. And so each year, if you've made an error, it's carried forward to the next year, which is compounded by the error the next year. It's like copying of medieval manuscripts. Once you've got an error in there, it's copied across. And if you add to that the fact that the errors were all in the same direction, what you've got is this apparent massive rise over a few years, where each year it was a slight change. But what kind of testing could confirm a rise in standards? What were the characteristics of a system? Well, the first is that you need a separate body to do that, which is independent of the policymakers. Next, you need this thing designed to last, and you have to think hard about the curriculum there and what you're actually assessing and what's going to be constant in 15, 20 years' time. You need to work on scales over time that are going to be the same scale. That's not necessarily the same test. In fact, there may be a problem having the same test, but you'd have items which get taken out, other items put in, and you're assuring that you've got the same test using RASH probably in the background there as your psychometrics, and you're very careful about what you release and what you don't, because what you want is that to be the same time of year when you do it using the same equated scales each time and on the same repeated cycles. So perhaps every year, perhaps every 3 years, 5 years, or whatever. And you need the same sampling procedures, and you want to have good sampling. If you get out to get them, you need to get nearly all the students doing it that you've got in your sample and no replacements, for example. There's something approaching that, something similar to that would be the NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Performance in the United States, which has been running for a long time, assessing maths, reading, and so on. And here's a graph showing the trends in average reading scores from 71 till 2012. we see amazing stability. A little bit of rise for the 9-year-olds, that bottom dotted line. Perhaps a little bit towards the end for the 13-year-olds, but maybe not for the 17-year-olds. Quite worrying considering the reforms that have gone into there, and something for us to take on board. If I put up the one here for average math scores, we're seeing a very similar pattern there. There definitely has been a rise, especially for those 9-year-olds. In fact, we've recently published a paper, that's David Bolden and I, on which some of this work is presented, and that's referenced towards the end. And I sent it to Dan Corrects because we copied him in, and he pointed out that if you standardize with respect to the within grade standard deviation, the maths changes over time really become large. And I'll quote him again on standards a little bit later. So what about monitoring at an international level? Well, I'm going to mention 3 here. So one is PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment, run by the OECD. And they look at reading, maths and science, or rather not actually at reading, maths and science. They look at literacies in those areas. So that there aren't maths per se questions. There are kind of, how would you solve this problem in the real world using the maths that you know? It's for age, and it's interesting to know age here, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. The Tymms, that's now called the Trends in International Maths and Science Study, that's run by the IEA. And it does maths and science, and it does it in 2 grade levels. Note they don't go for age, they go for grade, which makes the 2 a little bit incomparable. And, we need to keep that in mind. And Pearl's also run by IEA, so it's a grade focused test, this time of reading in grade 4 Pearls. I'm going to look mainly at PISA here. And I'm going to look at one particular study by Cesar Alosi, and did his PhD recently, and there's a paper on this towards the end. He's looking at PISA that had the results every 3 years up to 2015. Of course, there's more cycles than that. Another one since then. He looked at 63 countries that had at least 2 points of data. Some OECD countries and some had joined it that aren't OECD countries. And he was using reading and maths from the plausible values that are available. He had lots of available independent data, many from the OECD. Immigration's the first important one there. SES is an important one. He had the grade the students in as opposed to just the age that they were. And then he looked at policy-related variables. He did surveys of key administrators in all the countries to see when they instituted changes in the maths curriculum. And so I have a question for you. Just how stable are the raw PISA data as you see it from country to country? What would you expect the correlation for the reading literacy to be between the scores for countries on one cycle with the scores of the countries on the next cycle? Well, I'll give you the answer straight away, but I hope that you've, in your mind, thought of an answer to that. Well, they're all high. On occasions, they get up to 0.97 between, say, the results on the reading scores in 2009, 2012. Even between 2000 and 2015, the scores of the countries correlate with one another 0.92. These are incredibly stable figures, and if I put up the correlations for maths, you would see them to be higher. Let's look at those scores for maths visually rather than as a table. And there you see the ones in blue now are the OECD countries, and the red ones are the non-OECD countries, and the overall impression is pretty flat. You get a little wobbling around, perhaps sampling variation, perhaps impact of the curriculum, perhaps SES change, and you get some regression to the mean. After you've got extreme scores, you tend to come back in again, and so on. Amazing stability. Multi-level models looking at this changes over time with countries nested within time and so on. And a key thing to note here is that socioeconomic status predicts the PISA results, and that those have generally been increasing. So we've generally seen a rise in the scores from the PISA tests, and that rate varies across countries and across time. Hence we see some of the variation that we do. Overall, once you put those controls in, the PISA scores remains constant. If you look at policy variables, then if you try to look at the focus on mathematics, the changes that you were seeing amongst that stability, that slight wobbling around, were not related to the country scores. And let me come back to those two countries that I mentioned previously. So in Indonesia, they had major changes in 2003 to the curriculum, really set about improving standards in their country. There were some gains in maths in PISA 2006, and people said, oh, we've done it. But then there was a fall, 2009, and looking before to afterwards, there was no change. Look at Qatar, major reforms again, pushed for by economists, engineered in the light of the findings that you would have with the OECD and others. PISA leapt by 75 points and Tymms by 100, so they really had cracked it. But actually, we saw the gap between private and public remained constant, which seemed a bit strange, and in fact, further investigations showed this rise could largely be explained, by the motivated immigrants that Qatar was taking a lot of people with that flux and movement of people around the Middle East. Parallels, incidentally, the test score rises in the London area with motivated aspirant immigrants coming into the area. So we do have some effect sizes from PISA. They're about per year, about 0.01 per year. Pearls less than 0.01. Tymms grade 4. They're all around 0.01 per year. So you don't notice anything on a year-on-year change there. If you look across a decade, that means you're getting 0.1. If you look at 2 decades, 0.2. Gosh, it's depressing if you think about it. So what internationally we're seeing? Well, first of all, we've come a long way in 2 decades. We know much more now than we did. Internationally, we certainly do. There have been massive efforts to raise standards, but the basic skills have essentially remained constant. However, let's not forget that non-verbal has increased. Also, that students are getting higher qualifications, more are staying on, there's more educated people. Okay. Maybe you have to lower standards in order to get people to university. Within country monitoring, well, of course, England has shown us how not to go. The USA has really shown us a way forward here. And that's important to note. And I should mention here NAEPs, which is a major German initiative to track things over time. Germany wants to improve its aspiration, as we all are. And they've set about doing so in a number of ways. And one is right across the land with a federal position. They've set up a systematic monitoring through panels going through different age cohorts, measured across a series of pillars as they've defined it. And if you're looking to do within country monitoring, look to what Germany's doing. But many countries rely on the OECD and the IEA. Well, all of that needs some light throwing on it. What are the implications and the ways forward? The first is that although researchers have been doing a lot of work, they've been doing work to try to see what works in education. Have they found a way forward? So they'd been using randomized controlled trials as a kind of gold standard for checking whether something that you want to implement is actually going to make a difference. So there's a paper by Lotte Forgus, who's looked at the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF results over a number of years. And the EEF started about 9 years ago. It does conduct rigorous RCTs. That's where you take the program that you suspect is going to work, you want to work, it's got a new reading program, new maths program, you put it in and you do it to schools at random, and then the ones who are left after the randomization, they're the control schools, and you allow them to run this for some period and you see what the impact is. The idea being there's no bias here because those that were involved were picked at random. They're large, typically over 500 participants in these trials, and it's been in multiple schools. So typically 44 schools involved. That's large randomized controlled trials. There have been 60 of these. So we've got 114 different distinct effect sizes, depending on what they were looking at in the randomized controlled trial, and a lot of money's been spent on this. That's £28 million. Similar program in the United States, by the way. What effect sizes were found? Well, what would you expect? Again, I'm asking you to think about this, yes, and you're going to put your money where your mouth is. What would be the effect size on average of those that we've seen? Well, here's a plot of all the effect sizes that they found, and you can see here that the large effect size, those up to 0.8, were really based on, I'm just going to get something right here. The large effect size were very small samples, but the largest effects, so the largest sample sizes, that's up the y-axis, were producing almost no effect whatsoever. On average, this effect size of 0.07. So we were getting modest effect size, tiny effect sizes, in some cases that were promising, and maybe they need repeating, and maybe that's why you do randomized controlled trials, to pick out the ones that look promising and refine those and make them better. Okay, but as soon as you try to maximize their effect on the scale that you're doing it, then the thing fizzles out. And that's the problem for the policy across a whole country. As you try to make a large effect size, it fizzles out. This is similar results found in the United States. So we have a twofold problem. One, no affluent countries had a major impact on basic skills. I'm going to quote Dan Corrects again here. For decades, we've been studying, experimenting with, and wrangling over different approaches to improving public education, and there's still little consensus over what works and what to do. Not just little consensus, I would say, but actually little practical evidence. And the rigorously studied interventions have had tiny impacts. So I think it's time that we sit up and be noticed and stop saying it wasn't a good theoretical basis, or governments chop and change and are not well advised. We need more data. Once we start looking at subgroups, all these are true. All these are true. But the bottom line is, whoever, wherever, nobody's made this difference. Something deeper is going on here. So why have they not improved? Well, I think first of all, there's the question of timing, the timing by the politicians, or the timing of the interventions, or the timing of the policy changes. Often these are far too quick. A politician comes in for a relatively short space of time, wants to make typically his mark, and wants to do it quickly, and so introduces reforms before they have time to bed in and before the next one comes along and makes changes again. Also, you get a frequency of reform. They don't just introduce one, but another and another, and before this one's died out, the next one's coming through. And they do it because they're urgent, they want change to happen, but also because they've been advised to do it by people like Michael Barber, Michael Fulham. We need lots of reforms. They're all making a difference. And then we have the issue of carrots and sticks. More sticks than carrots, I would say, many often. So pressure is put on the schools. League tables are put up on the screen. People are named and shamed in public. What is the impact of that? Well, one impact is that you finish up with people reacting against it, playing games. And so you get gaming going on, ways to improve these things to kind of change without really making a difference. You also get people dropping out of education. Great educationists have been destroyed by an inappropriate carrot and stick system, even the odd suicide. And you get posturing. Frequently found amongst politicians. They're going to do this, they're going to do that, and really they have no intention of actually making a difference except to their own promotion. And they fail to take into account, these reforms often fail to take into account that it is hard to change the pedagogy of the teachers. So behind many of these, you want to change the way that the teachers are teaching. But many investigations have suggested, from Joyce and Showers to more recent researchers, have found that it takes a long time to work on in-service work to change the teaching of a teacher. It's said, as a rule of thumb, about how long it takes you to learn to drive is about how long you would have to go in order to learn to change to be a different way of teaching. Transplanting ideas is a popular thought. So we see that another teacher, another school, another country are doing better than we are, or the other people. Well, what are they doing? Let me copy some of that. I want a bit of the action that they're doing. So you go to China and you find the Chinese teachers of mathematics because they do so well, and you bring them to England and try to get them. Well, of course it doesn't work. It's ridiculous. If you find someone who's at the top level doing something, it doesn't mean that you should be doing that at the bottom level. You need to find out what made the bottom level move up higher. Well, I just spotted that I spoke transplanting too wrong. Please forgive me. There's resistance, of course. There's always resistance. If people have some things in their heads about the way that they're working, then they're going to resist the way that people want to change them because they've got certain fixed ideas. They think this is the way it works. Along comes anomalous data, and they've got reasons to explain that away. In fact, Chin and Brewer summarized the various reasons for this, and it's pretty tough to get somebody's mind changed for something they've thought about and found to be working over some long period. And then there's nature and nurture. Well, we've got kids who had a difficult birth and they were damaged irreparably at that time. And we can work hard with them, but you're not going to make them Nobel Prize winners. We've got people who were hit when they were young by violence in the home. We've got children who are damaged by drinking of alcohol during pregnancy, and then you've got fetal alcohol syndrome. We've got an effect of genetics. We've got all sorts of things going on, which mean that there is a population of kids who maybe need to change. We need to think about their medical background. We need to think about how to produce a nicer society which is less violent. That nicer society, of course, makes sure that prematurely born children stay and are brought into the school later on, and maybe they can have a little harder getting into the school situation. So what are the implications for policy from all that? Well, first of all, we need to know that managing nationwide change is difficult. And although ministers want quick action, maybe they just need to wait a little bit. And we often find that the advisors to the people here are economists. Maybe we need a little bit broader thinking here. So we need to be thinking in terms of decades. We need to think of education not as a unit in itself, as part of the whole society. We need to think about continuous improvement, as W. Edwards Deming would say. And we need to invest in our teachers and our teaching and our teacher training. We need to evaluate at all levels and to monitor the impact of what we're doing on a continuous basis. We need to think about the health of the young children, the health of the pregnant mother. If a pregnant mother is subjected to chronic or acute stress during that pregnancy, that can have a lifetime impact on the unborn child, and that's a cognitive impact. We need to be looking after these and securing them in safe environments if necessary. We need interdisciplinary, coordinated, systemic efforts. What are the implications for testing? Well, assume that all the issues that I mentioned earlier in the list are sorted out. Well, we need to consider more. For example, we've got changing populations, and I mentioned there the issue of Qatar and London, where they've got immigrant populations coming in there. And we need to take that into account if we're monitoring standards, not claiming or being blamed for changes which were not those. We've also got different age profiles. So as parents become older for their children, that has predictable impacts on their achievements at schools. And we get smaller families, 1s and 2s across the world, instead of 7s, 8s, 15s. We've also got changing economies. Maybe they're retracting now under COVID, but they were going up and we can expect them to go up again. And that will have an impact on the schooling. And we need to take that into account. I mentioned these biological issues, and we need to take those also into account. But there's also changing curricula. So if we are monitoring maths, that might be stable for quite a long time. We could probably say what kids are going to be learning in maths in 20 years' time who were learning it 20 years ago, but not history. You're never going to get the stability in there. Don't forget the changing testing skills are there, that the kids now are computer savvy who weren't previously. And the validity of our constructs are something that we should be thinking about. Why do the PISA literacies correlate so highly with one another? Well, and the fact that they do, does that mean that we have actually measured a different thing from maths literacy and reading literacy? It correlates so highly that you wonder if they are. But then if you start to read one of the maths questions, you'd realize that you've got to be pretty sophisticated at reading in order to be able to understand the question. And so maybe that's why so are we measuring different constructs? And when we adapt questions across cultures, are we really able to do that? Well, in maths, yes, we probably can do that and do that sensibly. If I ask you for a very young child, here are 3 balls. If I took one away, how many would I have? You can probably say that in Urdu and Spanish and Mandarin, and accept that it would be the same answer. But if it comes to reading, if we could Cantonese and put it into Malayalam, and then put it into Arabic, and then we put it into English, would they really be the same difficulties in those different cultures, in those different languages? Well, maybe. I know Pearls claim they've done it, but you have to worry about it. And what about asking people's opinions? What about asking people's their attitudes, or getting at self-esteem? Do you enjoy maths? Are you good at maths? Are you better than other people? These are questions which are culturally laden and hard to interpret. Well, I hope that by talking this way, I've provoked some questions that we'll be looking at in a moment. And there's a lot to talk about. But for the moment, I thank you for where we've got to.